So I went down with the anticipation that I was going to have the same amazing time that I always did visiting her. But there was one time that was different. And I arrived and she was grouchy and she wasn't dressed the way she normally did. And her hair wasn't done. And I didn't know what was wrong. And the person who was, she lived in an independent living facility where she could go anywhere she wanted. It was an apartment, it was quite nice. And I said to someone who worked there, there's something wrong with my grandma. And they said, don't worry, we're going to fix her. And I said,
welcome to another episode of Reframe for Resilience. And our guest today is Dr. Deborah Heiser. She is the CEO of the Mentor Project and author of the book, The Mentorship Edge. Welcome, Dr. Heiser.
thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
As we often do, we start off by asking our guests to share with us professional, personal, some episode in which they looked at things differently, implemented things differently, and that changed their perspective.
I'd be delighted to share an episode in my life that changed the whole trajectory of everything I do, and the way I thought. And that was when I went down to Florida to visit my grandmother when I was 19. And my grandmother was a fun grandma. She had 6 children. I was the oldest grandchild. And I would go down there and spend time with her. And I would not need to bring anything but shoes because she wore the most amazing clothing and was always so fun to be around. So I went down with the anticipation that I was going to have the same amazing time that I always did visiting her. But there was one time that was different. And I arrived and she was grouchy and she wasn't dressed the way she normally did. And her hair wasn't done. And I didn't know what was wrong. And the person who was, she lived in an independent living facility where she could go anywhere she wanted. It was an apartment, it was quite nice. And I said to someone who worked there, there's something wrong with my grandma. And they said, don't worry, we're going to fix her. And I said to myself, what are you talking about? What do you mean fix my grandma? And they said she has COPD. She's taking a medication that's making her depressed. We're going to change the medication. And the next time you come down in a couple of months, she's going to be better. She's going to be back to herself. And I didn't believe them, but it was true. I came back a few months later and she was back to herself. We went out, we did everything we ever did. She was, she had her hair done. She looked magnificent as usual. And I said to the person that worked there, what happened? What did you do? And she was a psychologist. And she said, we changed her medication. We knew she would get better. It was just a temporary setback with depression. I didn't know what depression was. I didn't know what a psychologist did. But at that moment, I said, I'm going to be a grandma fixer. And in the 90s, no one was talking about aging. No one was talking about, anything to do with making sure that depression identification was available or any of the issues at all that were happening with anyone in life were being addressed. And so it was an exciting time, like being in the Wild West, looking at something new and exciting. And that one moment changed my life, going down to visit my grandma.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. As you was, pardon me, as you were talking about that, I began to really think about the changes that grandmas go through as they age. And I'm a grandpa. And I was with my grandkids, one who turned, the eldest of them, turned 16 2 days ago.
Oh,
So
happy
I
birthday.
was with him and I was looking at him and thinking of what I was like at age 16 and how different I am today. But what was it at age 16 do I still recognize in me today? And so my question to you is, as you deal with many grandmas and grandpas, do they ever discuss who they are today and who they were in their youth and how that shaped who they became?
Yes, reflection is something that most people enjoy talking about. And that isn't a hard thing to engage in conversation with because I worked in a 705-bed nursing home facility for years. And going through, I got to know so many people and talking with them. The first thing they'd want to do is tell me all about their life and their journey and what it was like then, what it's like now. And I'll tell you that when I talk to people, their core identity never changed, who they actually are inside. But what they would tell me time and time again is that the growth that they had was being able to see more than just themselves, but to see themselves in others. So, for example, seeing what they taught others in the actions that the others were engaged in. And I always found that fascinating because I was young. So it wasn't like I was able to do that or see that when I was, in my 20s and early 30s. But as I've aged and I'm now in my mid 50s, I see it and get it. There's a shift that happens where, you're able to look at a person from a bit of a distance. And that's what they were expressing to me. So they really were always telling me that they got more of a richer, deeper feeling about life and others. And so everything just sort of built on what they had already had in themselves, but their core identity never changed.
And do you think this shift, namely seeing themselves in others, did that in any way help them to relate to others better than they
Yeah.
could have?
Yes, absolutely. And that's another fantastic question because we have an emotional trajectory in life, not just a physical one. So, we learn how to walk and talk and do all the things that we should. But our emotional journey are what you just asked are 2 points on the emotional journey. So in midlife, we hit a point when we turn about 40 to 65 where we engage in that growth where we're looking at ourselves outside and looking at how we live in others. And we do that when we engage in mentorship, volunteering, and philanthropy. So our goal at that point is we've sort of checked a lot of boxes and we've taken in a lot of wisdom and expertise and values and culture. And that's the point where we are trying to find others to embody a little bit of that. So we want to give our expertise and somebody else will run with it. That's when we can see it happening. And a person really summed it up well. He was the Nobel Prize winner in 2012, and his name is Bob Lefkowitz, and he made what's
Hmm.
called a legacy tree. And what he did was he said, I don't know how I became a, um, a Nobel Prize winner. I'd like to sort of look at who who guided me and who led me, and I want to see how I fit in with it all. So just like we have the ancestry.com tree that shows all of our relatives going back as far as you can find them, um he did that with his mentors. And so he had his mentors that he knew of, himself and those people who were lateral to him, and the few mentees that he knew of. And he published it in a journal. And he went to a conference not long after that. And when he was at the conference, somebody came up to him and he said, Hey, Bob, I'm 6 degrees Lefkowitz. And Bob said, What do you mean? And he said, Well, 5 people have worked between you and me. And so Bob said, Well, what are you working on? And he said what he was working on. And Bob was floored because it was Bob's words. It was Bob's work that had made it 6 degrees beyond him. And so he was able to really show how we see ourselves in others, but we can see ourselves in others like you probably can see a bit of you in your grandson. You can probably see a bit of his, not just his mannerisms, but the values, the culture, the tradition that you're passing down. When we think of legacy. Those are the things that matter to us that we look for in others. So we look for that nugget of ourselves that we pass down. So when when we hit midlife, that's when it starts to really peak. And then we race forward, getting more and more of that out there and seeing more of that.
How can we use that since you are uh, into mentorship and you're an expert in mentorship? How can we use that to help others resolve conflict
Oh,
by
you know,
seeing themselves in others?
we need to connect more. Connection is the core of generativity, which is that life stage I just talked about with mentoring, volunteering, and philanthropy. It really is, the only way I can describe it is when we get involved in civic engagement, we're able to see that we are not the whole world. The whole universe exists around, and we're just a part of it, and we get to see ourselves in that way. And we get to feel like a part of that. When we engage in mentorship, when a person sees someone who is older than them or who has more expertise in an area, they can see how they navigate something much more easily than they would. So, for example, when we're two, it's very common to throw ourselves on the floor when something's not working. It's very rare when you're 40 that you're still doing that. So a person who has a mentor is able to see much more quickly how you can resolve things, how you can look at something a little bit differently. It gives you a second set of eyes that helps you to see things a little bit differently. So mentorship is that connection that's meaningful. It's a trusted connection. It's one that you have a lot of value for in both directions. And when you have that, it allows the person to feel safe, to feel like I can have other options for how I can navigate something that doesn't feel like I'm in control of, that feels chaotic, or something that might be new ground.
You have described a lot of what I think about when I think of reframing, namely how you interact with someone, get their trust, and get them to see the problem from a different perspective and to engage that. And one of the things which I tell individuals is let's try to find a better problem to solve. And the better problem to solve is actually a problem that is related to the one that you have, but the solution to which will not only benefit you, but would benefit others. It would have broad benefit. And so when you talked about, as we get older, seeing ourselves in others, I began to think also of that part of reframing, looking for a better problem to solve. If we look for how that problem or a related problem is also affecting others,
Mm-hmm.
it probably will help us to find that better problem to solve and to reframe our situations. What do you think about that?
I think you're 100% right. I love your work on reframing and how prior to this meeting, we talked about your work on reframing, and it's brilliant. I mean, I think that the way that you've looked at reframing makes it accessible to everyone. And reframing is a good thing. We all need to reframe. When you're caught in a problem, or even something, it doesn't matter how small it is, you can't see past that. And sometimes we need someone to help us to reframe it, to either say, that's not as big as you thought it was, or it's bigger than you thought it was, or maybe you should just put that on the back burner for now and look at something else, like you just said. And we need people to help us, to guide us through that. We all get into situations where we need to reframe throughout the day, at any given point.
So, Dr. Heiser, as we wrap up this brief conversation, what's the one advice you would give to our listeners as a real tip to help to build resilience?
To help build resilience, I would say look to your left and look to your right. You're looking at someone who knows something that you don't know. And every connection that you have is going to help you to be resilient.